Well, just as for us, that Bali bombing 20 years ago was a very traumatic event. So people are dealing with trauma and the memories are still fresh. 88 Australians were killed, but many Indonesians were killed as well. And of course, it was Indonesian territory. One of the things that's coming out, though, is on both sides, all sides, just how much people helped each other in the aftermath of the bombing. And of course, we know that on the policing side, too, there is a good news story that cooperation led to the capacity to deal with terrorism. So it was controlled. It's not become a major problem. There were a series of other terror attacks after Bali. None of them was big, but the problem was largely, and it is largely controlled. And it's a lot to do with that cooperation. So behind the sadness and the sense of loss is a sense that still good things can happen.
Yeah, and that's really what I want to hear about from you is, you know, we've been listening to survivors of those bombings, Indonesian survivors, saying they don't want to go back to Kuta. They are still very nervous in those kind of big groupings. Should they still be nervous?
Look, I think the thing about terrorism, Bev, is we sort of can't let the terrorists win by completely distorting the way we live, certainly not by being suspicious of each other and succumbing to hate, but even getting on with life. I think we can be grateful for the fact that there is such good policing work, whether it's in Australia or in Indonesia or across the region, a lot of that coming directly out of the cooperation after the Bali bombing, that it's no longer an existential threat. It's not a particular problem. You know, you're more at danger of having a traffic accident than you are from terrorism. So we need to put it into context. Of course, you know, this is a problem that's not going away. The Indonesian police are arresting hundreds of people every year, so it remains a resilient threat. But the terrorists are reduced to lone actor, small-scale attacks, and therefore I think we should be confident about getting on with life.
So when you say the threat remains, what is it that continues to sort of brew within Indonesian society?
Well, it's not so much that it's coming organically out of Indonesian society. The Jamaah Islamiyah group that was formed out of fighting, training in Afghanistan in the late 80s and early 90s, formed in 93. They came back to Indonesia after the fall of Suharto in 98. Most of them decided it was neither the place nor the time for violent struggle, violent jihad. But a small group of young men, led by charismatic recruiters like Nordin Top, were behind the Bali bombing and the bombings that followed. Most of that network, although it's still intact, recognises that they'll get into trouble if they get involved in violence, so they've refrained. We had another wave with Islamic State supporters, and we know that story. It's, you know, 2,000 Indonesians probably went to Syria, Iraq with Islamic State, so it's familiar to our Australian story. But it's not organically produced out of Indonesian society, just like the problems with Islamic State weren't organically produced out of Australian society. Most people completely reject this, and a lot of civil society groups are working to counter violent extremism. So it's a very contained and very limited problem, and the police are certainly on top of the problem, but it's a resilient threat. There's intergenerational radicalisation, and that's why rehabilitation and trying to break that cycle is so important.
And, you know, Greg, when you talk of rehabilitation, of course, a number of the Bali bombers were sentenced to death. Others served long prison terms, but there's been quite a bit of angst about the fact that one of the masterminds will soon be released. Yeah,
I mean, there's always a gap between law and justice, in effect. Umar Patek was one of the guys who assembled the bomb, who was a technician. He wasn't given a life sentence, he was given a 20-year sentence. And typically in Indonesia, as in Australia, people don't serve a full sentence. They get out on parole with remission earlier on. The good thing is they're under parole, so some control. But Umar Patek to be released, as is expected, after 11 years, you know, seems outrageous. But behind that outrageous story is the fact that Indonesian authorities are attempting rehabilitation. They use the term de-radicalisation, which is unfortunate because cognitive de-radicalisation takes time, difficult to achieve. But disengagement from violent networks is the key. And I think in that case, they've achieved that. He's under surveillance when he does get out anyway. Those networks are under surveillance. I think leaving aside the outrage of that individual case, the more important thing is that they are trying not just to arrest their way out of this problem, which of course is not possible. You can't arrest your way out of terrorism. But they're also trying to break the cycle of recruitment, and they are having success in that front. But, you know, rehabilitation, disengagement is never going to be perfectly safe. So you need a belt and braces approach. You need to have surveillance. As we're discussing with people being returned to Australia from Syria, we need to be realistic, but we also need to try and break the cycle.
And, you know, when we had those so many conversations over the years, Greg, about radicalisation and the fact that it cannot only be a policing approach, is there enough work being done at a community level within Indonesia, do you think, that is addressing that possibility of radicalisation?
I don't think there's enough work being done, Bev. There's a lot of work being done, but there's more that's required. There's a lot of good cooperation between Australia and Indonesia on this front, and we're learning from each other. But there is certainly more work that needs to be done because Indonesian police are still arresting 200-300 suspects every year, and most of them are prosecuted through open court. So there's a real problem there. But I'm encouraged by the work I see with civil society organisations now working with police. There's a relationship of trust there, that they're having real effect. But, this is a really wicked problem. It's a very resilient threat. And, perhaps it's the case that there will never be enough. But I think that we can do a bit more in this space. We've done a lot of work on the policing side, so now doing more work on it's called the soft side, but, it's not really soft as against hard. It's really just the essential component to surveillance and arresting is to try and break the cycle.
Yeah. Well, really good to get your perspective on quite a significant day indeed. Thanks for your time, Greg.
Thanks, Bev.